right. We're here with Elemer Piros from Roth Capital. Thank you for joining us.
My pleasure. My pleasure.
All right. Nice to speak with you. So the reason I invited you on is because Microdose has kind of been covering the psychedelic medicine space and acceptance into Wall Street and the greater investment community. So we wanted to speak to some experts in the space, and everybody I know is asking me what the heck is going on with their shroom stocks. So I figured might as well get an expert on to talk about what's happening. So maybe start with a little bit of an introduction, and we'll go from there.
Yeah, sure. So I'm a senior biotechnology analyst at Roth, and I started focusing on psychedelic stocks. Started focusing on biotechnology about 22 years ago now. I'm a neuroscientist by training, and back in 2000, I started working for investment banks as an analyst covering the sector broadly. And I had so much disappointments with neuroscience-related companies, neurology, psychiatry, because it was just a graveyard, failure after failure after failure. So I nearly abandoned the field until someone made me read Michael Pollan's How to Change Your Mind book, which precipitated a 4-month journey, so to speak, into the literature of what was known about these substances and their clinical benefit. And I became a very committed follower on the space in general, psychedelic stocks in general, and specific ones as well. Now it's about a year and a half ago. You asked about the market, what the heck is going on with the shroom stocks? I have no idea about the market. Yes. They have their own thinking or mindset. But, we are living through a very difficult tech market in general. Biotechs in general, or as a group, underperformed even the tech sector over the last year and a half. So it is very difficult to rise up from this sort of background. So stocks like Atai, Compass, Mind Medicine, Cybin trade along with the market. And unfortunately, the gravity is so great that even data, very significant phase 2B data from Compass Pathways couldn't help, apart from the initial positive reaction, just pulled even that stuff down. And, we could talk about the data, we could talk about the details, but it's just a clear sign that until things stabilize in the overall market, we'll probably have a difficult time to break through.
Right. So, I mean, in general, I'm assuming it's tech stocks that have a tough time keeping up with difficult market conditions, and biotech, and then really new speculative biotech even has a worse time. Is that generally the way things go?
Yes, absolutely. And there is always the factor that in a difficult environment, it is going to be very costly to raise additional capital, especially those who don't have more than a year's worth of cash. So they don't have the luxury of waiting it out. This luxury, the Atai, Compass, Mind Medicine certainly have. And so they don't have to be nervous about it. But some of the earlier stage, smaller companies are running on fumes, and they would have to either discontinue their programs, merge with someone, or raise capital at not so nice terms.
Yeah, we're seeing that definitely become a reality this year. And it's going to be, that seems to be the theme for 2022, to see who's going to be able to, which smaller cap companies will be able to survive this extended funk in the market. And we're starting to see some consolidation and a couple of firms discussing closing up at least divisions, or one or two have already kind of discontinued their psychedelic operations. So the big players seem to have enough capital to be able to withstand this storm, and then we get down to the middle tier. I mean, we still have some kind of Cybin, Field Trip. There's some companies with some decent cash reserves to get them. I guess it's when we get down to the lower T where it feels like a danger zone for a lot of smaller cap companies. In a situation, in a market condition like this, is obviously the pipeline's important, their developmental programs are important, but in these kind of really dire extended funks, is cash the main thing we're looking at here to see who's going to be able to make it?
Yes, cash and the history of the company, of what sort of investor base they have, which will probably determine whether those who are committed for the long term would be willing to double down and buy stock even at a lower level.
When you say investor base, is this like existing raises who they've worked with in the past? Is that something you look at?
Yes, because otherwise we see the market almost completely shut, apart from a handful of transactions, and even those transactions that do occur are being led by or participated by existing investors. So it's very important to have that solid base. And unfortunately, due to historical facts, these companies have relatively thin, sophisticated institutional ownership, which will be required for the long-term sustainability. They were able to raise as a group over $2 billion over the last 2, 3, 4 years, beginning from being private, and then IPOing and entering the public markets. But now those who had this transition or transitory interest from investors will have more difficult time, because people look at these charts almost as a self-fulfilling prophecy that there must be something wrong. The fundamentals in the biotech sector are probably crumbling, which is not true. The fundamentals or something about psychedelic medicine is not what we previously thought it might be. Therefore, I'll just wait it out. I need more data, I need more information, and I'll come back later. That might be the attitude.
Yeah. Even though fundamental wise for the industry itself, nothing's changed from a year and a half ago when MindMed was at $6. Fundamental wise, nothing's changed. If anything, we've progressed pretty consistently forward as an industry.
Yes, I mean, just a metric about the state of the art. When we issued a review on these medicines back in March of 2021, we had 20 some odd clinical trials were ongoing with these drug candidates. Today we have 40 plus. So over that short period of, I mean, even the 40, just to think about that this industry has been nowhere 3, 4, 5 years ago, except from a few academics. Now we have 40 trials, including phase 1, phase 2, phase 3. So all phases of development are covered here. That will ensure that we'll have news flow during the next 12 to 24 months, which will be meaningful, especially if we are dealing with more advanced clinical trials. I mean, not a publicly traded company, but the MAPS organization will probably release their second phase 3 results in PTSD towards maybe in the fourth quarter. That should solidify the earlier results when they've seen 2/3 of those treated with MDMA go into remission. And these are just cannot be ignored.
Yeah, that'll be a big boost for the space for sure. So yeah, it reminds me of something I've heard. You could tell me if you agree. The kind of, or it was kind of maybe a perfect storm of difficult market conditions across the board in global markets. And then we had this timing of where this nascent new psychedelic medicine industry, a lot of early stage investors weren't necessarily long-term investors. And with the, all the way back for a year and a half, people were worried about the state of the market, recessions coming, COVID, inflation. So people pull their money. It's a safe thing to pull your money out of speculative spaces. Is there anything more speculative than psychedelic medicine right now? So people, maybe early stage investors were pulling their money, and are we waiting now for a new kind of crop of more long-term biotech investors who will re-enter once we get more phase 2 and phase 3 results, and that will be like a more solid influx of capital from the market?
I believe so. One clear example, a company that we don't currently cover, G8 Research, is a roughly $500 million market cap company. Their institutional holdings is impeccable. They stayed relatively above the entire sector as things were going south, because those holders have strong hands and they are committed for the long term. So that's just one example of where you can look into some stability. And if you examine the ownership of some of the other companies, they had an amazing IPOs. IPOs performed wonderfully, but then there was profit taking. And if you look at their ownership today, it's again just a handful of the original investors, and now we are waiting for regrouping and gaining interest back, because they thought that a hypothetical IPO price at 30, the stock was worth buying and selling at 50. Then at 6, it may be attractive again, especially since they advanced their programs and they matured.
Yeah. So we're perhaps reaching that point where buying the dip seems to be an attractive space. If the surrounding market conditions maybe are leveling off a bit, this may be a time where people are starting to look again.
I think so, because once we are, so this is the typical reaction that I get from investors who don't have the foresight but want to wait for signals that are extremely strong, etc. Let's just call a hypothetical stock price that is 5 now, and when it runs to 10, 15, and I call them up that there is definitely activity here, there is momentum. Why didn't you call me when it was at 5? It ran too fast or too far by now. So it is worth looking for these early signs. I mean, it's certainly, and I'm not a technical analyst of charts, but there are some signs in NASDAQ, even in the biotech index, that there is some leveling off. And God forbid inflation remains in check or we have peaked. I think the overall appetite to own equities and very speculative equities will increase as well.
Right. I mean, there was enough enthusiasm a year and a half ago that I guess we'll assume people had their palate, they got a taste for it, and they may be waiting for the right opportunity to come back in. It seemed like institutional investment had just started to pick up. I was hearing more and more news of Wall Street being accepting of psychedelics, and then did we get cut off just as it was starting? Did you see a building institutional acceptance that kind of got cut off by the downturn in the market?
Based on the attendance at expert events that we conduct with investors, I see the number is stable, if not growing, in the audience. And the feedback, the follow-up, the questions, the interest, the level of sophistication is also seem to be more there. And there is I think, a growing understanding, and I'd just like to spend maybe a minute or two to an analogy to cancer immunotherapy. Cancer immunotherapy is essentially a one-time treatment awakening the immune system for the invading tumor. The immune system itself then starts the fight, and if successful, and in statistically speaking, in 35 to 45% of the patients, remission can be achieved, meaning a disease that was terminal before, now for about 40% is curative. There's a curative solution.
I think there was some interesting news about a day or two ago about an
100% remission in 12 patients.
Yeah.
Now, we are not there yet with psychedelic medicine, but if you think about the paradigm, a one-time treatment that awakens, opens the door into some processes in the mind that will initiate the healing paradigm on its own, just like the immune system does. I think it's a very close analogy. And when you look at solid data indicating that 25% of those who suffer from depression treated once with psilocybin go into remission and stay in remission for at least 3 months. We have no longer follow-ups yet. 2/3 of those who are treated with MDMA go into remission up to 6 months. There is a remarkable similarity that is very difficult to ignore. And so I think this sort of recognition of converting someone with a terminal condition, because once you become resistant to 2, 5, 10 different drug regimens, you essentially are sentenced to life with that condition. And to be cured after a single dose of a substance, that's very remarkable.
Yeah.
Sorry about the sidebar here, but I think
no. It seems like an apt analogy. Speaking of sophistication and examining, I mean, then it ties into how do we craft the commercial models for something, pharma is used to more chronic delivery of medication, and we may be changing things up here with the psychedelic medicine model. Is that something you hear from investors, that psychedelics, how are we going to commercialize this thing?
Yeah. So there is a handful of school of thoughts out there. There are companies who, and for example, the MAPS organization places a very significant emphasis on integration. So 3 doses of MDMA spaced 2 to 3 weeks apart, followed by up to 12 weeks of psychotherapy, and then they measure the results. At the other extreme, there are more of a typical conventional pharmaceutical mindset that apply the drug. In this case, it's 5-MeO-DMT by GH Research, provide the supportive environment, and have follow-up care available, obviously not necessarily tied to the drug, but the patient is assumed to be in the care of a psychotherapist to begin with, continue that therapy. So rather than a strong linkage with drug treatment, there is more of a liberal approach. And I don't think anyone is really thinking about gene therapy like cures. If someone suffered from an addiction, trauma for the last 20 to 30 years, it may be relatively easy to put them into remission, but to keep them in remission is also a very difficult, if not more difficult task. Think about relapse after smoking cessation. So I think retreatment is going to be part of the paradigm, but it's an extremely small price to pay to go every 6 months and spend a handful of hours in this setting, and then in between live a perfectly normal life.
Yeah, it does seem to be shifting how we view mental health treatment for a more holistic approach, rather than taking a pill and going home with traditional SSRIs. Yeah, this the approach to psychedelic medicine, which seems to be a broader view of things, is going to translate into a different commercial model. So it's evolving now before our eyes. There'll be questions of access and affordability, but those things seem to be working themselves out slowly as we go through this.
Yeah. So just touching on accessibility, if we only had a solution, I'm thinking LSD, that will take 10 to 12 hours for the treatment duration, and the million or so patients, or 10 million, or 80 million, if you look at a whole bunch of conditions, would have to have only that solution, then we would be in trouble. However, we have very short-acting psychedelic substances, such as DMT, 5-MeO-DMT, that will take half an hour for the treatment component. We have non-psychedelic psychedelics, so psychedelic-inspired drugs under development, which could be taken in the at-home setting periodically. So the entire spectrum seems to be covered, and we could think of this as a pyramid approach, a convenient non-psychedelic treatment regimen for the vast majority of people with easy access, and increasingly more involved, more holistic, if you will, and more resource intensive treatments to those who don't benefit from the traditional SSRIs or the psychedelic inspired drugs.
Right.
Psychedelic.
Yeah. Do we foresee perhaps a kind of hybrid model where maybe one or two or a handful of intense psychedelic assisted therapy sessions, followed up by perhaps some third generation non-psychedelic compounds at home that allows you to upkeep these things? So companies may be companies like Field Trip, who have both the drug development and clinics, maybe setting themselves up to offer kind of that whole kit, especially for people who maybe can't afford to have a 6-hour therapy session twice a year. Maybe they'll afford one, and then we have some at-home treatments, some hybrid model like that.
Yeah, absolutely. And unfortunately, if we are talking about depression, it's so heterogeneous that that's the reason why we have a maybe 20 to 30% response rate with SSRIs. Genetics, the environment, the current condition of the patient, the history of how long this depression was on, all sort of predetermine what you respond to and what you may not. And if we have alternatives to try, that would be a tremendous advantage, whether it's a more robust, more intensive treatment regimen that leads to ego dissolution, or a gentler approach that may be sufficient for someone else. So not only the combination, but the alternatives that are being developed right now, and they'll be available during the next handful of years, is also an option. And there is also an option of, while the jury is out on microdosing, how effective it might be, but a large dose treatment followed up by microdosing, once we learn more about how effective that is for maintenance, could be also as an alternative.
That sounds like an option. I had a thought, but it slipped away there. You got me thinking about microdosing. So I was wondering if you would predictions for 2022. What do you, how do you see the rest of the year unfolding?
So if the current environment persists, small news may fall on deaf ears, but the phase 3 readout from a second pivotal trial from MAPS would definitely be something that would generate interest.
Mm-hmm.
Compass Pathways is at a crossroads. They just had a discussion with the FDA, and it's the results of which is not public yet, on what is their phase 3 design. Do they have to conduct 1 or 2 phase 3 trials? Would the previously reported phase 2B be large enough or significant enough to be considered as one of those pivotal studies?
Mm-hmm.
These are the options. So if we get something that would clearly delineate what's the timeline for their phase 3 plans and potential launch, that would also set expectations in a more narrow channel, as opposed to, we don't know if it's 1 or 3 years or 4 years.
Exactly.
So all of this is fairly significant, and I think they would be the representatives of some attraction towards the sector, because now in our review, we listed over 40 clinical trial results that were from some controlled trials, and that list grows, and we are getting more and more significant, large clinical studies that will mature. So, but these two events, these two announcements, I think could be significant. Should a consolidation start to occur between the larger, better capitalized, and the smaller, earlier stage companies, that could also trigger interest, obviously. But that is difficult to predict. Results and timing of those is much easier. But M&A is always tough.
And I mean that's something the market looks positively on. I guess depending how it's
certainly
structured.
You know, that certainly is something that would rescue clinical programs where the alternative is to put things on shelf, and that certainly would encourage people to see that from those who are better capitalized, there is an interest in those programs, what is developed by a smaller company. So, and they probably have a level of sophistication that could really make a judgment call that we should acquire that program, since they have the expertise. So that's almost like a proxy to investors and to analysts, that they had a thorough examination of the opportunity, and they decided to pay a premium to what the market tells us correctly. So it's a very positive sign.
So that's a signal that even though it may be a smaller firm that the market ignores, that there's valuable work being done, even at the lower levels, worthy of purchase.
Yes, and there is maybe just one example that unfortunately the market completely ignored. Mindset Pharma just licensed, maybe I want to say about 3 months ago, 2 of their preclinical programs to Otsuka. And that's, to my knowledge, Otsuka is the first pharmaceutical company that expressed interest, other than Johnson & Johnson with Spravato, in medicines with psychoactive properties.
Yeah, that was news. It probably should have been bigger. Within the, the nerds in the industry, we saw it as a good sign, but the market didn't react much.
Right. No, absolutely not. And there is another sign that is a little bit more difficult to predict in terms of how much interest is there from pharma. If you look at the executives of some of these companies, they come from a 10 to 20 to 30-year pharma background. And that is also difficult to ignore, because what they'll learn at a startup that they just joined, or a already publicly traded company, their results will trickle back into Eli Lilly, into other pharma companies, Novartis, Merck, and that's how the interest will be generated from these insiders, so to speak. So it's actually a good metric to follow, that what sort of background the individuals who are
trickle back through word of mouth through within the industry?
word of mouth or formal discussions, business development, licensing, M&A, because now it is someone that they trust has developed or have developing that program, because they were former colleagues.
Right. So the amount of pharma executives involved in the space is another important measure.
Yes.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
Yes. Just looping back to the acquisitions. I mean, today we had an announcement of Cybin acquiring Entheon's DMT trial. So that wasn't a merger, but that was an acquisition of one of those early stage. So yeah, it's what you said, not allowing early clinical work to go to waste, and somebody put a dollar value on it and found it valuable. That's an example of what we're talking about?
Yeah, small steps, but this, and we actually commented on this formally this morning. This jumpstarts Cybin DMT program by about 9 months. This phase 1 trial that they acquired was started in February in the Netherlands in 50 healthy smokers. It's an interesting study that could be used now by Cybin to advance their own CYB004, which is a deuterated version of DMT.
Yeah, definitely. Cybin's been one of the most active companies in terms of consistently putting out news and showing the market that they're active and that they mean business on on a variety of fronts. So they've been pretty consistent. So yeah, I appreciate this chat. We should do it again. So I was going to ask you for any kind of underdogs or anybody you're looking at who's not part of the reports you've done. I mean, you mentioned it's GH Research.
Yes, yeah.
They've been very quiet. And sorry to cut you off. Go ahead.
Yeah, very quiet because they're gearing up for a phase 2B clinical program. What is remarkable there and is that they work with 5-MeO-DMT, and the single administration of the drug leads to remission in 7 out of 8 severely depressed patients.
This is based on their is there 2A results, or what was that based on?
There's no control group. The observation is only for 1 week so far, but it's just remarkable. And so I keep a close eye on GH Research as well.
Yeah, they're well capitalized, and
I think that they have north of $200 million in the bank, and so they're fully funded to, I think, even through their phase 3 trials.
They're nice and secrety. They even went public without much fanfare. The mysterious company out there in Ireland, I believe.
I think they are headquartered in Ireland. Yeah.
Okay. All right.
And remarkably, if you look at their holders, they're the who is who in the biotech industry. So quietly, but with some good following.
Yeah. No, thank you for that insight, because that's was something I wasn't looking at, I guess, in enough detail. those kind of institutional support will help companies withstand the ups and downs as we go through this, multi-year time horizon.
Yes, absolutely will.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you very much, Jason.
No, thank you. It was great. It was great to talk. Let's do it again, and maybe we'll get you on a psychedelic capital panel one day soon.
Love to. Thank you. Thank you again. Have a great day.
I appreciate it. Take care.